Greetings from the United Nations headquarters in New York. I'm Lise Kingo, CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. Today, together with our partners, Principles for Responsible Investment, We Mean Business, the World Economic Forum, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the B-Team, the UN Global Compact Academy is pleased to host this second briefing on the private sector engagement in the upcoming UN Climate Action Summit. So since the first briefing, preparations for the summit have evolved. Yet, despite a few encouraging announcements from governments, business leaders, and investors, there remains a huge opportunity for all stakeholders to step up their climate ambition. The economic case for ambitious climate policy is clear, and the business community has a critical role to play. We need your leadership to create the tipping points necessary to turn this climate emergency into an opportunity. And just last week in Abu Dhabi, governments, businesses, civil society representatives, and young people met to plan for the final ascent to the Climate Action Summit this September. So today we will reflect on the progress so far and highlight ways that business and investors can best contribute to shaping the global climate agenda. I'm delighted to be joined by the UN Secretary-General Special Envoy for the Climate Action Summit, Ambassador Luis Alfonso de Alba, and advisor to the President of the Board of Trustees at Yokotech, and a board member at PRI, Letitia Tongwe, and the Chief Sustainability Officer of Mahindra Group, Anirban Ghosh. In the next 40 minutes, we will hear about what happened in Abu Dhabi and update you on further engagement opportunities. We'll also be answering your questions live, so please submit them anytime using the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform. But let me first turn to you, Ambassador de Alba. You have just returned from Abu Dhabi, from this very exciting event with, I believe, 1,700 participants. So can you explain to us why did this meeting take place and what were the key takeaways in your mind?
Well, first of all, I think it is important to go back a little bit and explain that we have been working with through a number of coalitions with a number of governments, businessmen, members of civil society to identify proposals, concrete actions that could be proposed, presented at the summit. And in that sense, Abu Dhabi was a very important meeting on which we were able to make an assessment of where we were and a selection, pre-selection at least, of the proposals which are the most encouraging, the most ambitious one. Because the intention at the summit is to be very selective, to showcase those actions that have a transformative impact, that can be replicable, that can have an impact in the real economy. Not just a long list of initiatives. All initiatives are going to be recognized, but they cannot all be showcased at the summit. So the selection of initiatives coming from each of the tracks, and in some cases initiatives that would be the result of a combination of efforts between different tracks, was the main purpose of the meeting. And we have succeeded, I think, in identifying a concrete number of proposals. Those proposals still need to be worked out, and probably a few additional ones may still come. But basically, we have an idea of what kind of proposals could be presented at the summit.
Well, that sounds very exciting, and I almost feel like sort of asking you a little bit more in detail, so what nature they have. But you know, there are the 9 very important tracks for the summit. So are you seeing some great example in any of these tracks in particular that you think will be like really role models that everyone can be inspired from?
Well, each of the coalitions is working on its own, and as I mentioned, there are some proposals that may be the result of a combination. I think it would be a little bit too soon to give you the precise
Of course,
scope of the proposal, but to give you an idea, we started with the work on mitigation and particularly focusing on the efforts that need to be done by major emitters. And we got some very encouraging results. Some countries, several countries, I would say, have already announced that they are going to be ready to present new enhanced NDCs, hopefully NDCs that would be aligned with the 1.5 degree target. Some governments have announced very important decisions to go to a carbon neutrality even before 2050, like it was the case of Norway during the meeting in Abu Dhabi. It has been the case of the UK before. It has been the case also of Chile, Costa Rica, other countries. So I think in the mitigation chapter, we were quite encouraged to see that there is a movement which is quite positive. On the industry sector, I think we also heard about a number of developments in some sectors. I would highlight particularly the shipping, transportation, cement industry, metal and aluminium, which are making also a significant step to initiative that could make a transformational or could have a transformational impact. But we are also working with individual companies which have become increasingly engaged. Many of them are joining the 1.5 degree campaign of the Global Compact. They are engaging in the discussions on just transition, and they are also beginning to work with governments, which is quite important, building partnerships, because the NDCs, the national determined contributions, aligned with the 1.5 will never be achieved if it's not through the partnership that the governments need to develop with the business sector, with the private community.
Exactly. But it's really great to hear that there's ambition both on the side of the governments and also on the sides of the companies. And this idea of creating positive ambition loops between governments and private sector. So you feel you are beginning to see some examples of that?
Yes, there are many proposals. I cannot go one by one, but there are many proposals on which we still need to go into the details. But the fact that they are working together, governments and representatives of the private sector, is very encouraging. We had meetings on which they were both with other members of civil society in the rooms. We also have a dialogue specifically with representatives of the private sector. And I think the overall process is moving. But we need to recognize that we are very far from what we still need to achieve, not only in September, but immediately after September, because the objective of aligning with the 1.5 IPCC report will require radical changes and much more ambition.
So today in our program, we have a large audience with stakeholders and companies from all over the world. So what is your message today? What could companies do from now to the summit in September to really contribute to the positive energy that you are driving across the world?
Yeah. Well, I think companies have three different options, and they could be combined. The first one is to undertake individual commitments to join campaigns like the ones we mentioned on the 1.5 degree or the just transition. They can also join with other companies to try to move the sector in a different direction and to have a collective expression of will, and they can also increase the dialogue and the cooperation with the government. So those are three different areas on which they can work. They can engage in the preparation of this summit through the coalitions that we have built. They are going to continue to work until September. They can also work through the Global Compact and my own office. We can guide them and we can encourage more participation, assuming that we are going to be able at the summit itself to showcase proposals that are going to be coming from the different stakeholders. And all the stakeholders need to be in the room. They need to be recognized and they need to be encouraged to do more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for these very concrete reflections. And personally, I can't wait to see who will be the sort of best practices that we will see in New York. The champions, exactly. So for governments and businesses achieving a net zero world by 2050, it will require innovation, collaboration, and transformation on a scale never seen before. And in order to stimulate this increased ambition from the private sector ahead of the Climate Action Summit, the UN Global Compact, together with more than 25 partners, recently launched the campaign Business Action for 1.5 degrees Celsius, Our Only Future. By challenging businesses to set science-based targets at the 1.5 degrees Celsius level of ambition, we hope to see new leaders from the private sector stepping up to address global warming. And we plan to recognize those leaders at the Climate Action Summit on the 23rd of September, just as the ambassador was mentioning. In addition to our 1.5 degrees campaign, we also welcome a recent launch of the Business Leadership for a Just Transition Pledge, another great example of how the business community can step up to tackling climate change. To provide more insights into the important role of the business and investor community, we have invited two colleagues to join us remotely for this live session. So let me now turn to Mr. Anibir Ghosh, the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Mahindra Group, who is in India. So welcome, it's great to have you with us today. Your CEO, Anand Mahindra, has been one of the front figures to join our 1.5 degrees Celsius campaign and be a leading advocate for what we are trying to do. So I think you and the Mahindra company is a great example to sharing with all of us how science-based targets can actually help a large group like the Mahindra Group in becoming a more responsible company.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been wonderful listening to the ambassador on developments that happened in Abu Dhabi. We see the science-based targets as an expression of ambition, ambition that will help us adopt a stretch goal and that will trigger action. We have seen in the past that whenever the goals have been stretched, the organization has been able to do things which were earlier not considered to be possible. We expect the same thing to happen in the area of climate action. We expect priorities to become sharper. We expect the scale of action to increase, a lot of innovation to happen, and therefore we do expect that adopting science-based targets will help us do business better.
So is this a kind of very ambitious call to action that is generating energy throughout your organization, a little bit like having to build a cathedral without knowing exactly, where to put the stones?
You have said it very well. It is indeed a situation like that. And the process of discovery is exhilarating in itself. We believe that 1.5 degrees is possible and that we must go forward and adopt all possible methods to get there.
So what would be your advice to some of all the companies that are hopefully considering and thinking about also joining our 1.5 degrees Celsius campaign? I mean, what would be your advice for companies that are thinking about joining these days?
We would possibly say that don't think too much, just come in and join, else you're likely to get left behind. we must recognize that as corporations work towards achieving their share of the 1.5 degree target, there will be a lot of innovation within companies. It will make them more competitive. It may even transform the organization. And if some companies wait to join, they might just miss out. So I would tell them, don't get left behind. Specifically, if one looks at what will take us to 1.5 degrees, it's fair to say that we will have to discover renewable energy at scale. We will have to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles. We will have to build green. And we will have to ask the question, how do we leverage climate action to do better business and not get left behind?
Anibia, thank you so much for summarizing in a perfect way why it is that it's not only responsible business but also good business to join our very ambitious campaign for 1.5 degrees. So thank you so much. Stay online. We will do some questions in a moment. But now that we have heard a little bit from the business side, I would now like to turn to the investor side, because we have seen strong support for climate action from the investor community over the last few years through the TCFD and the Climate Action 100+. And earlier this month, PRI was part of a coalition of investor groups gathering 477 investors with $34 trillion in assets under management behind an urgent call to the G20 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So joining us from France, we have Laetitia Tanguay, advisor to the president of the board of trustees at Yokatech and board member of our sister initiative, PRI. So Laetitia, it's great to have you in our program today. And could you explain to us a little bit from your perspective what you see as the main initiatives that are driving the financial sector into a greater understanding and involvement on climate change today?
Thank you, Liz, for having me here today. I'm very happy to participate to this briefing. To answer to your question, when I picture climate, I see climate as a horse which is galloping very fast, incredibly fast, and we investors and actually stakeholders in general, we are struggling behind to try to catch it. It's an incredible challenge, but it's possible. And it's possible because we have different tools, individual and collective tools. The first one, very obvious one, is for investment decision. Companies have to know, they have to understand that when they take concrete actions to tackle climate change in their core business, this is something we look at. This is really something we pay attention to. It makes a difference. It adds value. The second tool will be proxy voting. Annual general meeting each year, it's a very important moment for companies and investors because this is an opportunity for investors to flag different issues to companies. For instance, Yokatech assess every year the climate-related strategy, performance, and governance of the biggest companies in its portfolios. And if the conclusion of this analysis is that companies do not sufficiently take energy transition into consideration, then we may consider vote against a different management proposal. We can, of course, engage with company individually and collectively. And I'm very happy you mentioned the Climate Action 100+ initiative. For those of you who have not heard about this initiative, I strongly encourage you to visit the CA100+ website because this initiative is a very exciting initiative where investors from all over the world collectively engage companies on different climate-related issues. And on the website, you can have a look at what has been achieved so far. As investors, we can also decide to divest from companies and from whole sector. You may have heard that the Norwegian pension fund last month confirmed their decision to reduce the exposure to the oil sector, and for financial reasons actually, because they want to reduce the exposure to stranded assets. And Ircontec also 2 years ago announced its decision to reduce its exposure to the oil sector for climate-related reasons. And at last but not least, that the tool investors are using more and more frequently. And this tool is policy advocacy. You know, with collective, with initiatives such as the Climate Action 100 Plus, investors are collectively engaging companies one by one. With policy advocacy, we investors collectively are trying to push policymakers to take the right decision so that we can implement the correct ecosystem, that we can address climate change. And the PRI and other partner open letter you just mentioned is a very good example of the kind of initiative. So yeah, maybe just I think what is also very worth mentioning is that the initiative we're talking about are not led by a small number of responsible investors, but they are led by a growing number of responsible investors and also by mainstream investors from all over the world. But I think it's very positive.
Thank you so much, Laetitia. And I have to say, I really like your image of the horse. So instead of holding on to the tail, the investment community is now getting into the saddle, taking control on where the sector want to go on climate.
Exactly.
And I mean, listening to you, it sounds like this is a very determined, active process. So Laetitia, explain to me, when investors are evaluating companies, how does climate today, in your mind, constitute a part of the risk evaluation that the companies are doing, and how are the private sector picking up this emphasis on climate as a risk from the financial community?
Mm-hmm. Climate, more and more, it has to be integrated at each steps of the investment decision. You know, many investors committed to the Paris Agreement, and now they have to fulfill the commitments. So when you invest, there are different steps. When you take your investment decision making, for instance, Ircontec, we have a green funds, and in this green funds, 1 billion euro green fund, we're going to try to pick the companies on different criteria, of course, different financial criteria, but also on climate-related criteria, such as best in class, best solution, best effort. That is to say, we're going to select the company that are really part of the solution because of the product and their service. And also a company that may be in the oil industry, but that we feel that they are following a good trend, that on the long run they will have good performance, and we're going also to select the one in a specific sector which are the best of their sector. So at the first step, when we decide to invest, we integrate climate related criteria, and then we also integrate climate when we have to report, because as investors we are pushing companies to report on TCFD, but this is also something we want to do for ourselves. So we totally know how challenging it can be. So we do know it's a work in progress. We start last year. I think we did better this year, and we will do better the next year. So we also integrate climate after the decision, after the investment decision in our own report. So this is really something we have to think about at all stage of the investment.
So Laetitia, a final question that I'm very curious about. So you are representing a very large pension fund. So how many of your clients are requesting from you that you are investing their personal pension savings into responsible companies?
Actually, Ircontec is a pay-as-you-go pension scheme. So we don't really invest the money of our client. What we invest is Contact reserves, and those reserves are meant to guarantee the pension over the long run. So it is really a decision from the Board of Trustees to adopt a responsible investment policy in the whole assets, and not really a request for beneficiaries. I think for Contact is more a top-bottom approach, and we are educating our beneficiaries through communications. But keep in mind that 100% of our assets are invested in compliance with responsible investment policy. And, I think if each investors allocate 1% of its asset to the green finance, then we will meet the Paris Agreement. Contact invests almost 7% of its asset. And that is the result of a strong political will of the Board of Trustees.
Excellent, Laetitia. And let me just add that I believe that across the world, every year, 19 trillion US dollars across the world are captured by pension funds across the world. And we are looking for 2.5 trillion every year to close the financing gap of the SDGs. So the sector you're representing is a hugely important one. Thank you very much for your great remarks. I think maybe our audience is becoming impatient now, and we will get to some of the questions that that we are receiving from our audience. Ambassador, the first question is to you. There's a question here. How optimistic are you? Do you think the summit will achieve its objectives?
Certainly. I'm optimistic, and I think it will achieve its objective. But we also need to be aware that this is a long process. It's not a one-day effort. It is an opportunity for many stakeholders to recommit and to do it with much more ambition. But we will need to keep working for those efforts to grow, to get all of the member states, to get all of the companies. And it's an effort that, according to the IPCC report itself, implies a very huge effort or work during the next 10, 11 years if we want to be on track. So I think it is important to look at the summit as the opportunity to launch a different path of action, more intense, taking the image of the horse that is running fast. We need to run at the speed of the horse to catch up, and we need to do it in a constant manner during the next 10 years at least. And to do that, we need transformation, we need innovation, we need partnerships. And the commitment of the Secretary-General, precisely because of that, is not only to host an event, to host a summit, but to engage in a follow-up process of the decisions and the actions that would be identified at that summit. So we will continue working in the immediate term with the COP25 in mind, which is going to take place at the end of the year in December in Chile. And immediately after, we will be looking into the next COP, which is the COP on which all member states need to come with enhanced NDCs and new commitments. Once again, hopefully all aligned with the 1.5 target.
Yes. That's a very important topic that you are bringing up. The new set of plans, hopefully many of them aligned from the governments with the 1.5 degree scenario.
And the business.
And the business. So
together.
The 1.5 degree campaign actually works both for business and governments.
Absolutely.
And we need the ambition loops to make the whole thing a reality.
And we need the innovation, and we need to showcase. It's not sufficient to highlight the emergency of the situation. It is necessary to show the solutions.
Yes, exactly. So you are also seeing this as a long journey where every step of the journey is important.
Absolutely.
And September in New York, I get the feeling, will show some new innovation and some new kind of collected ambitions, that collective ambitions that maybe we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and hopefully a different way of work, even within the UN system. The system as a whole needs to move. We mentioned that at a previous occasion, a previous conversation that we have. We need to recognize that Paris has been a great success, and negotiations have basically finished. There are a few issues which are pending, but mainly we have achieved a goal. Now we need to implement.
Yes.
Now is the time for the system as a whole to be more supportive of actions, and the system should be supporting not only governments, but all stakeholders, whether we are talking about local authorities, whether we are talking about organized groups of civil society, and certainly businessmen. They need to get the support of the system.
Yeah. This is truly a multi-stakeholder task that we have in front of us.
We have no other option.
No, exactly. So, Anirban, if I may turn to you, I think there's an interesting question that has come in from you, which is, so how do you at the Mahindra Group encourage investors, I mean, as a company, to align their portfolios with 1.5? So is this something you are bringing up with your investors?
We are having a conversation with many of our investors. We do an annual ESG call on issues like this. And the way we are having the conversation is to highlight risks that are occurring to business because of climate change. And these are not only weather risks. There are developments happening in technology, developments happening in regulations. There are consumer preferences that are evolving, all of which are causing new risks and new opportunities for the business. And investors need to be aware of these developments and need to see which companies are adapting to these developments to get a good sense of who is going to make money in the short run and who will be around in the long run.
Thank you so much. And Letitia, I have another question for you that runs a little bit along the same lines. So that goes, how can we push our pension funds to divest from oil and gas companies or increase pressure on them, and maybe even making them stop investing in the whole coal business?
Well, I think it will depend on what kind of pension fund you're talking about. If I take the example of Iacantec, as I told you, the whole responsible investment approach is the result of the board of trustees' political will, and they decide, because Iacantec signed the Paris Agreement and really want to fulfill this commitment, so they decided that it was a topic we had to discuss. Actually, it was quite long. It took 1 year, the scheme, to really think about all the stakes, because, of course, there's climate, but there's also social stakes. And we are very also concerned about just transition, about the whole impact of the decision the scheme makes. And after 1 year, we assess the pros and cons, the different impact, and the scheme decided to partially divest and to have, I think, a consistent strategy, which is different when you think about bonds, equities, or specialized companies, major companies. So we have, I think, a quite comprehensive policy, and we will try to assess this policy over time, and probably it will evolve. For other pension fund, maybe pension fund who really invest the money of the beneficiaries, I know that there are some pension funds which annually run studies to understand the expectation of their beneficiaries. And I think it's just a question of good governance to be able to listen to what come out of those analyses and to be able to address them. And if not, to explain why it's not possible right now.
Excellent, Letitia. Thank you so much. I think there's no doubt that a lot is happening in this space at the moment, and I think it's really great that we have both an investor and a very progressive company sort of explaining to us a little bit more in detail what is happening out there. And Ambassador, I want to come back to you for a question that we are also being asked. So you have a very long history of being involved and engaged in climate and within a UN setting. So what do you think is different in preparing for the summit in September? I mean, it's no secret that the political instability in the world was a little bit more calm when the Paris Climate Agreement was actually adopted. So to what degree does that have an influence on the preparation and the success of the summit?
Well, I think we obviously need to recognize that there have been some setbacks and political will is not at the highest, and that's one of the objectives of the summit, to signal the importance of that political will to be showcased. And we are working with all member states, regardless of whether some of them have changed their policies in the last few years or few months. And we will continue to work with all of them because we don't see any other option. The option of doing nothing is obviously out of the table. The option of ignoring what a country can do because of a policy, it's not an option. And whenever we talk about countries, member states, we have to be aware that we are talking about a number of stakeholders within each government. And we need to be aware that there are cities and businessmen and civil society organizations, and even the governments who have changed policy, they still have initiatives, activities that as a whole continues to work in favor of the fight against climate change. So we need to continue to engage, we need to raise the political ambition, but we need, first of all, I think, to recognize that even the political will may have some setbacks. The level of pressure from civil society, from the public opinion, has increased dramatically. People around all the world is very much aware of the danger and is asking for action. Youth, in particular, has demonstrated that during the last few weeks in a very strong way by organizing strikes and by asking governments to act. So we have the support of the population. We have the technologies, because many developments, especially on renewable energy, have made it easier to achieve the goals. And we have certainly the majority of actors engaged in this process. So I'm optimistic.
Well, I think you have very good reasons to be optimistic. I mean, you have all the good forces behind you for the summit. I think it's fascinating to see how many stakeholders are rallying around the summit, and population, youth, everybody realizing that climate is not an issue that somebody out there will solve. It's something each of us have to be deeply engaged in.
Absolutely. And if you take the business sector in particular, 10 years ago, the business sector was reacting to the invitation, to the pressure of the governments. Today, frequently, it is the opposite. It is the industry, it is the private sector which is asking governments to speed up.
Exactly, exactly. And I also think that, you know, we have this ambition that we want to see real tipping points, examples of big changes, big shifts that are happening. And I think the summit will also be a great way to show some of these tipping points, in which area they are happening, to create the innovation and the inspiration that everyone who wants to be part of making a difference is looking for.
Yeah, and we are looking into a transformation of the economy as a whole. So I think it is also important to keep in mind that immediately after this summit on climate, we will also be assessing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole. And we will also be looking into the financial aspects, the means of implementation for this agenda. So it's a development agenda which is at stake, and we need to succeed.
Well, we all wish you good luck, and we are definitely in this together. So I think we have come to the conclusion of our program and our debate today. And as we have heard, our climate ambition and actions need to be bolder if we are to stand any chance of winning this race. This Climate Action Summit is an important opportunity for business, as the role of the private sector in multilateralism evolves and becomes still more important. And we are now beginning to see an enhanced approach to public-private partnerships designed to deliver on the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So the UN Secretary-General António Guterres, just as the ambassador said, has been emphasizing at the G20 summit in Japan that political will has been stalling, and that his Climate Action Summit in September will therefore be a key opportunity to increase and accelerate ambition among all actors. So in wrapping up, I would like to thank Special Envoy Ambassador Di Alba, Letitia Tanquay and Annie Bargosh for joining us today, and thank you, our audience, for being part of this special UN Global Compact Academy session. Our teams will follow up with you very soon. By working together, we can address this global emergency with ambition and urgency. This is a race that we can and must win.